Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most wild and surprising historical paradoxes of the 20th century. I want you to imagine a strict, revolutionary communist regime. We're talking about a government that literally just fought a brutal, bloody civil war to abolish private property and completely smash the old world order. Now imagine that exact same regime suddenly turning around and using free market capitalism to save its own economy. Sounds pretty much impossible, right? But that is exactly what happened in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, with a fascinating pivotal strategy known as the New Economic Policy. So how exactly does a hardcore communist regime end up using capitalism to literally survive? Well, to figure that out, we've got to rewind a bit to the devastating economic ruin right after the Russian Civil War in 1921. You see, the Bolsheviks had seized power back in 1917, but the immediate aftermath was just this intense period of severe hardship, societal chaos, and basically a total breakdown of normal economic function. Okay, let's dive into this. The leader of the Bolsheviks, Vladimir Lenin, actually had to justify this massive ideological U-turn to his own party, and he did it by calling the move taking one step backward to take two steps forward later on. Lenin basically realized that to reach his ultimate goal of socialism, he had to hit pause. He needed to enact a temporary strategic retreat into what he called state capitalism, just to get the country modernized and back on its feet. Part 1. The Crisis of War Communism. To understand the pivot, you have to look at their initial policy, known as war communism. This system relied on forcefully requisitioning grain from peasants and completely outlawing any private trade. The Bolsheviks were trying to run the entire economy purely by decree, literally trying to replace money with a clunky system of barter in rationing coupons. And the results? Absolutely devastating. By 1920, industrial production had tanked to a terrifying 13% of its pre-war levels. Agriculture wasn't doing much better, sitting at roughly 20%. This total collapse sparked a horrific famine in 1921 and 1922 and triggered massive, violent pushback, like the famous sailor mutiny in Kronstadt. Basically, the Bolsheviks' hands were forced. The system was failing fast. Which brings us to Part 2, Lenin's strategic retreat. To avoid a total system collapse, the regime desperately needed a new playbook. At the 10th Congress of the Russian Communist Party in March 1921, Lenin and the Politburo officially roll out the New Economic Policy, universally known as the NEP. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer scale of the shift. Under war communism, you had men with guns forcing grain requisitions plus a primitive barter system. The new NEP completely scrapped forced requisitions. Instead, they introduced the Prodnalog, which was just a fixed tax payable in raw crops. To stabilize the chaos, they even brought in a gold-backed currency called the chervenets, which eventually let folks pay that tax in cash. But the biggest shocker? The NEP actually allowed private citizens to own small and medium-sized businesses and freely engage in private trade. But make no mistake, the Soviet state wasn't just handing over the keys to the castle. Sure, small mom-and-pop shops and artisan crafts were suddenly perfectly legal, but the government kept an absolute iron grip on what Lenin famously called the commanding heights of the economy. This meant the state deliberately maintained strict, nationalized control over the big stuff: heavy industry, the banking system, and all foreign trade. Part 3. The Rise of the Netmen. Opening up even a partial free market sparked something huge. It essentially gave birth overnight to a massive, highly controversial new social class. These opportunistic private traders, business folks, and craftsmen became known as the NEP men. They were the ultimate middlemen, connecting the rural farmlands with the hungry urban cities. And man, were they effective at jump-starting the stagnant economy. By 1922, these private NEP men accounted for nearly 75% of all Soviet retail trade. They pushed commerce into vast stretches of the country that the central government just couldn't reach, essentially acting as the primary engine for the massive economic recovery of the 1920s. But the reality of actually being a netman, it was seriously complicated. Yes, they were saving the economy, but party loyalists absolutely despised them, viewing them as capitalist class enemies living right under their noses. State media constantly stereotyped them as greedy nouveau riche. Observers at the time even joked about the automobile harem factor, pointing out how these new elites flaunted fancy cars and lavish, over-the-top lifestyles. Because the government only ever saw them as a temporary, necessary evil on the road to socialism, netmen were heavily taxed, constantly harassed, and even officially stripped of their voting rights. Part 4. The Scissors Crisis. So the NEP works. The overall economy bounces back to pre-war levels by 1928. but it accidentally creates a massive new problem. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the wild imbalance it shows. Because farmers suddenly had a real personal economic incentive to sell their surplus crops for cold, hard cash, agriculture absolutely boomed. Crop production leaped by a staggering 40% right after the terrible famines of 21 and 22. The problem was that heavy manufacturing, which, remember, was still under that clunky state control, was recovering much, much slower. This imbalance led to what Leon Trotsky famously coined the scissors crisis, named because of how the price lines literally crossed each other on a graph like an open pair of scissors. It played out in 4 rapid steps. Step 1, agriculture booms. Step 2, because there's suddenly so much grain flooding the market, agricultural prices plummet. Step 3, meanwhile, those inefficient state-run factories hike up their prices just to cover their own costs, making manufactured goods crazy expensive. Step 4, the peasants do the math. They realize they have to sell mountains of cheap wheat just to buy basic, expensive consumer goods or farming tools. So what do? They just stop selling. They start hoarding their grain, waiting for prices to go back up. Part 5, Stalin's Great Break. This whole economic mess fueled some serious political fire after Lenin's death in 1924, leaving a massive power vacuum. Let's trace this timeline, because it happens fast. The NEP is introduced in 1921. Lenin dies in 1924. This immediately kicks off a vicious power struggle. You've got guys like Leon Trotsky arguing they need to ditch the NEP right now and heavily tax the peasants to fund state industrialization. On the other side, Nikolai Bukharin champions keeping the NEP to maintain peace with the farmers. But then, Joseph Stalin outmaneuvers both of them. He initially allies with Bukharin's pro-NEP wing just to get rid of Trotsky. But by 1928, once Stalin has ultimate control, he completely flips. He abruptly abandons the NEP entirely and rolls out his own highly centralized top-down first 5-year plan. Stalin essentially argued that these small private family farms from the NEP era were never going to produce enough grain to fund the massive rapid industrialization the state required. During the grain procurement crisis of 1928, Stalin aggressively blamed wealthier peasants, branding them kulaks, for hoarding all the grain. This justified his brutal policy of forced collectivization, violently seizing private land to create giant state-run farms and totally abolishing all private commerce by 1931. Just like that, the era of the netmen was definitively over. Let's move to Part 6, the legacy of the NEP, and see how this builds into modern history. Because despite Stalin's brutal reversal, the theoretical framework of the NEP echoed loudly for decades. Jump all the way to the 1980s, and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev attempts a very similar mixed economy restructuring with his perestroika policies. He actually directly referenced Lenin's NEP as a historical justification when he pushed through the 1988 law on cooperatives to allow private businesses again. And it wasn't just in Russia. Over in China, Deng Xiaoping heavily studied the Bolsheviks' NEP. He openly acknowledged it as a highly effective model for socialism, using its core principles of blending market incentives with state control to fuel China's jaw-dropping modern economic rise. So the crucial point is that this brief, wild 1920s experiment in Soviet state capitalism fundamentally shaped the global debate over socialist economics for an entire century. We literally watched strict state control lead to initial ruin, saw how introducing market incentives sparked a dramatic economic miracle, and then witnessed rigid ideology crush those very markets again. It's a fascinating cycle, and it leaves us with one final provocative question to think about. Can a command economy ever truly thrive without a foundation of free market enterprise?